Well, a goody córa an gédal sias mahan is An Náisiún fíorcin fóilseúh agus táthas an dánar an greibh sibh an bhéilinn. Tá siad an úsán sort seminar grúb ag gachlá le pádraig a cheap méid gur rih tábhacht le buint le cuasaíoin an bliain seo agus tá bhórsan chun seo thos an dánar ag rééis sin an len. Ach go háirithe go an talamh mar chean corrad Kieran Vincent and may kind sort of agus tá tábhacht le buint le sin. May I just say on behalf of Sabina and myself how pleased I am, and I know what an important day it is because you all probably had responsibility for things this morning earlier or whatever, but thank you very much for making the effort of being with us. We usually have a seminar on St. Patrick's Day, and I thought this year, for many reasons, that it was a good idea, that I wanted to get in touch again with those who are, as it were, active on the ground, and particularly in relation to community arts. When I was the programme for the second period of my presidency had a number of themes, and one of the themes was Samhlaíocht agus Cruthíocht, which is imagination and creativity. And the idea was to celebrate the power of creativity. And as I was preparing a speech, and there would be two versions of it, I'll probably publish the long version, but the other version about it. But as Kieran and I were thinking about it, it brought me right back to the 1980s when we were all activists. Indeed, we were just, so much was happening at that time, going back, and we were also the project and others. And there was something that I should tell you about is not quite fully over, was the debate about community arts. And very much the idea was the old person saying, is that the standard will suffer, the idea that excellence would have to give way to this popular democratic participation. And I do remember someone actually going so far as to write, if he only realised there are some people who have no creativity. And so, well, I have to say, one of the things that was very, very, very important was later on when I became Minister for Horticulture and the Gaeltacht in 93-97, and Colm O'Brien, my late Colm O'Brien, who was my advisor, and when we would be debating things every now and again, we would keep coming back to the Benson report. And the Benson report was precisely about that. It was about the significance of creativity and in the human person and fulfillment and so forth. And I kept referring to it very, very often. And its author is there, and it's 46 years now since it was published. That was the great, great gift of the late 70s. And then what happened after that, in many, many cases, was Sandy Fitzgerald and I said we were creative activity, creative art for everyone, and so on, and Peter Sheridan and others, and Dan Byrne organised. I'll have Kieran talk about a very famous seminar in the north side of the city, but it actually started in 1983. And I remember I was Mayor of Go in 1981, again in 1991. But to give you an idea of the flavour of the time, it was that I remember if Charles Lynch, the pianist, would, for example, want to come to Galway and so on, and I would send him the train fare in advance, and he would stay on for an extra couple of days. Artists were, in fact, in penury, And there was this notion as well that, you know, that this mightn't be a bad thing and so on. It was, of course, a great nonsense, because the fact is that people had to live. But then, as Sabina and I were married in 1974, but it just meant as well that I was aware of particular circumstances of individual artists. I remember poets writing to me, for example, and they would say, "Michael T, the electric is cut off again," and I would go and see him and we would talk about that. So there was this notion of the acceptance of that. So it was necessary first that I became convinced then that you would never ever make any progress unless you had a ministry that was able to sit as an equal with the other 14 at the cabinet table. But more importantly as well was the debate. And Kieran's work was incredible. Was because of the incredible, well, about shining a light on what was not there in education and what might be there and what should be there. I'll give you an example of what we dealt with. Helen Bygrove was the first arts officer appointed. And I remember we tried to organise a seminar on dance in Clifton. And we got a letter back in many cases, and it said, physical education has nothing to do with dance. So, and that was fine. We said we'll still go ahead. And then not only were not expenses given to teachers to attend such a seminar, but they organised a compulsory seminar at the same date so as to make sure. And we were, Helen Bygrove and myself were experimenting with murals in schools. So they would say, "That's just Michael T and his murals." And I remember as well, we also had a piano. We had a baby grand that we would put in effectively a horse box and bring it out to Carrow, and then we'd get it tuned, and then we would put on a performance and so forth. And we got a letter warning us that if anything was to happen like this, it would be run by the department through the VEC, and please desist immediately. But I do want to say thanks so many people, but I particularly want to thank Damien McGlynn for being so helpful to us in organising this gathering here, because I think that Damien, as Director of CREATE, the National Development Agency for Collaborative Arts and Social and Community Context, I so very much want to thank him for his help in organising this event, but also for the very important archive material which he has supplied. And there was a meeting in the North Star Hotel in 1983, and the first national seminar cafe was held on the 27th, 28th and 29th of April 1984. I chaired that meeting, and Anne Byrne organised it. But I remember well, we broke into 6 groups, and then a person spoke about how they had in fact transacted what were the issues, because it was wonderfully vigorous. Colin spoke, I remember very early on. So the first half of the day said the speeches were coming from the one direction. So there was a kind of, everyone had to. And then the next thing, of course, I think it was Peter Sheridan, and said, "We're just worn out," she said, "unless something happens regionally, nothing will happen." I was chairman of the Galway Mayo Regional Arts Committee, and I worked quite long with Helen, who was wonderful. And it was, I should say immediately, something you will all know. As I looked at the evolution of the position of arts officers, and particularly community arts, right through the very much, some of them reported to the manager, some of them reported to the county engineer, some of them reported to somebody else, and everything. And effectively, we had a good relationship, things go down and so on, and it all would come to be later. But I think, in a way, what was the brilliant thing of Kieran's thing was the idea that creativity was not separate in the personality from the normal development that one could take place for it. That, in other words, that it was an essential part of the person and so forth. That was quite revolutionary in its time and it enabled us. There was something so powerfully humanising about that for me. And what Kieran had brought to the Benson Report, as it became then known as, was a brilliant analysis of the social and cultural psychology, philosophy, psychological background to creativity. I would come to see this much, much later when I was dealing with works in theatre. Really, what happens the person in the performative act, and how brilliant it is, and how important it is, at all stages. I think in many, many cases, I always remember getting that letter and Helen and myself talking about it. It was around that time, I think, as well, that I had proposed the first grant for Druid Theatre of £250. I remember two of the councillors saying, in many cases, what if they put on what we don't like? And I remember saying, I said, have you thought about blindfolds into your mouth? And if there was something you didn't like, you could pull them down. But I was very energetic at that time. Later, and it became very important. And that was when I before I became minister and afterwards, when I was speaking about culture afterwards. It was very interesting. I would quote Margaret Mead and about Malinowski and others about, they would say, we don't have anything separate for our arts, it's the way we do things, that it was the totality of life and so on. And that was very important because I think in a way, and I so see it in conversations I've had with Africans and others in many cases, the way in which a kind of almost as a sleight of hand, a version of modernity can present itself as a single version that doesn't take account of a whole series of both the inherited and current and imagined ways of life of a people. The issue was very, very much as well the issue of the public space, which is why I'm so glad that you're all here. What happens in the public space is incredibly important. The idea that, for example, there are so many battles that have been associated with this. I remember having to make the choice between community radio, for example, and commercial radio, and pointing out that, for example, that if you gave away the audience, it was very hard to bring it back. And therefore, these were ideas in the exact same way in relation to the idea of public performance in open spaces and the roles of local authorities, and were defining spaces in which you could have performance. I suppose what we were all of was kind of an aggregate of ideas, a set of discourses, a people's street, and so on. The writing that particular time was in very many cases, there were good things which I'm afraid we lost in the meantime. And that was the difference between, in architectural terms, the whole street and individual pieces of houses and others. This is something I remember giving a paper in Norway some years ago. I think what is very, very important in that regard, in many cases then, was, yes, there was still a huge gap in venues which would stay there until the end of the 1990s, but also there was an insensitivity really to how it works. I should say, and I'll end it, and when I ended at the end of the 1990s, And I thought back about it, about how the word management was so abused. There simply wasn't a feeling for what happens when you have artists and producers and graphic people all working together who want to put something on. It's not about making galvanized buckets. And sometimes in many, many cases, you had this notion out of the fragile, not the very deep end of management thinking. The idea that everything could be managed to the same. And that remained a weakness. I remember talking to Colm about this and saying, it is a particular experience. Now, remember when I have said in that meeting we had in 83, 84, it was the employment scheme, really, we were debating as to what, in fact, how should it be used and could be used. But much of what, in fact, emerged came from people with hardly any income. And they were all on these short schemes and so forth. So what then was to happen if you moved into a kind of tension between people who said, we know how to manage things and so forth, and you had the people who had actually brought things into existence, be it in relation to different kinds of performance. And that was a very, very, very real issue. I think where your own work has been incredibly important. And look, I must say when I read in the international press that all the public bodies now in the United States have to remove diversity, equality and inclusion from their mission statements. And it has happened right across the board. Columbia University has lost $400,000, particularly, but there are also universities taking it out of their mission statements. And it is to the great credit of the work that all of you have been doing that you have in fact actually seen that what is new and what has come, in fact, is not in any tension with what was there. I think there are some marvellous things. The other night, when I was at Martin Hayes' notion of the way he has combined the traditional and contemporary composition and so forth. And this is brilliant. Now, I was very anxious for this St. Patrick's Day, in many ways, to draw a distinction, really. And I have said it to the President and Government in a way. It's very important to recognise the work that the art officers are doing right across the country in urban and rural settings and so forth. And it is also, I think, something else which was happening that struck me was commodification. We are at a time when it took generations, it took decades, it took a couple of centuries to establish, for example, freedom of the press and the freedom to publish. We are now in a position where, in fact, we are losing that freedom. I must say, as a person of my age, many make the idea that a couple of billionaires would decide what people will consume by way of reading or publishing or whatever is just simply an outrage to democracy, and it should be called out, and I do so. Now, I do remember as well at that meeting in the 80s, I remember writing a piece about the limitations of Homo economicus. This is something I actually had borrowed, I think, from Keynes originally, from John Maynard Keynes, and which was making the point in many cases that Homo sapiens was incredibly important. But the one I went on, I remember writing about, was Homo ludens, about play, and about the importance right across the cultures, and right on from the writings and Carnival of Bakhtin and others. There was a huge importance attached to being able to turn the world upside down for a while. And that meant, I think, that we really needed to give space to those who were genuinely original and of its nature automatically subversive in relation to, because looking at the history of arts and innovation and all across the arts in relation to Europe, one finds that very often it was from the periphery and the innovative, challenging material came. I do think, in relation to it all, why on this St. Patrick's Day, 2025, my last St. Patrick's Day in An Náisiún, I do want to think that we need to recover our language. And for example, about being able to look at not just, if you like, single answers, but the beauty of explanation. And I often think now, and I looked in a way, at the heavy price there was when you find concepts that have really no meaning, concepts like the West, which, as I think An Náisiún grammar has described, as in fact an old myth in a new form. But really the thing was, when you look at how all the different pieces of culture have come to be without boundaries. I often think, for example, in relation to mathematics and the Chinese example, where in fact the art of explanation is seen as an art rather than a single correct or non-correct answer. I think in that case, many cases, this is why when the arts are working, and particularly community arts, and when people's creativity is accepted, both in relation to what has come as heritage and what has been innovative and been imagined anew, it's such a powerful force for democracy. And exactly the opposite happens when you get a commodification that kills, and in many, many cases say there's a huge difference between the wonderful piece of performance and the idea of purchased entertainment. The idea that you must, when I used to hear this about, the idea that you must try and find what's working abroad and then put an Irish stamp on it, that's not very original, frankly, in relation, but I better say no more about that for the moment. But I do think that it is, I felt a bit sorry about one form of the arts, I must say, as I went, and that was dance. I remember Sabina and I, for example, we did succeed very early on in getting sprung floors put in the schools so that you wouldn't have to injure yourself to want to do the more simple dances. But equally, I think as well, I think when I think of contemporary dance and how important it is, it still needs privileging in my view. I think all of what you're doing and all of what you encourage people of all ages and backgrounds to do is an encouragement to experience life in all its complexities and all its wonder. And I so thank you for that. And I do think as well that in many cases, I remember going out about, it didn't fall from the sky. For example, I remember I had a bus ticket system. So it was in order that we would be able to have touring performances. And Helen would go out to the schools and we tried to get the children to bring the news home to the parents. And we would give a joint bus and admission thing to whatever was going on. And we had actually to go and I had to go and talk to the union, I remember, about this and all of the rest of it. So what I do think, this is very, very important, about the commodification, it can also come from the very best intentions, and it doesn't help. And there is the huge difference between event organising and the community arts and what you're saying. The contribution made by those who make it possible for people to go away and do all new things and encourage others and talk about it and discuss is very different than from a single event when you say that it went off and the fire alarm didn't go off and nobody broke a leg. And eventing is fine to a point, but it is a very small part of what I'm speaking about. I just want to say, I think then again at that meeting, I don't know whether Sandy is here, But I do remember about it. It was the most wonderful point in my own life, and Colin Breen and Kieran and all of the others. And when we were on the road for cafe. And the interesting thing and the good thing, I remember years later, between 1994 and 1995, when I had the opportunity of spending about 120 million on venues and that, it was said to me, they'll be like white elephants. I gave an interview to RT about that, and they said, they'll be like white elephants. What will you say to it? They were full from the beginning. And the most interesting thing is that we were able to do sound tests on them so that it would work properly, get commitments from the local authorities for at least 7 years, and so forth. But I am so grateful to all of you for all of the work that you're doing in your different ways. And I'm so delighted that Cafe has continued with its new vigorous name. And I do think as well that it all fits together. If your thinking is right in relation to creativity, it'll help you make a policy in relation to communications and radio and film and broadcasting and so forth. And I think, for example, when I think of the encouragement it gave to members of the travelling community and others, to know that their stories were respected and that there was something wonderful that they had a possession of. So I think by encouraging collective creativity, and that is the main thing about it as well, is beyond the individual experience, is that when ideas are being shared and when the joy of something is being shared, we have, I think, we are at a time where we have to recover the conditions of peace. We are in conditions of war. But as you have been listening to me, I was Minister for Culture, but I was Chairman of the Culture Ministers of the European Union in 1996, at the same time as Melina Mercouri was there from Greece and others. That was the Europe we wanted, a Europe where we could do all of this kind of talking about culture and so on, and how different and how shabby, if you like, a European Defence Union would be as an alternative. So this is the world we must recover again. And you have been just so wonderful about doing it on the ground. And I think that with the kind of work you're doing, the performer and the performative and the respect for that, I think it creates a critical consciousness among the people that has secondary benefits in practically every part of life. Míle buíochas as tír. Thank you very much.